I won the lottery. Pack your things and leave my mansion. That was the text my husband of 42 years sent me while I was standing in the checkout line at Kroger, holding a gallon of milk and a loaf of wheat bread like it was any other Thursday afternoon. I read it once. Then again. The words didn't change. The fluorescent lights above me hummed softly, and the teenage cashier asked if I had a rewards card. I couldn't answer right away. After 4 decades of marriage, that was how I was dismissed, 8 words and a period at the end. I didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of the candy racks and the tabloids promising miracle weight loss and celebrity scandals. I simply paid for my groceries, placed them carefully in the trunk of my Buick, and sat in the driver's seat with my phone still in my hand. My mansion. We had bought that house 32 years ago, when interest rates were high and Richard still wore discount ties to his job at the insurance office. We painted the walls ourselves. I planted the hydrangeas by the front porch. I remember measuring the kitchen island with a tape measure, arguing gently about whether we could afford granite countertops. I had worked part-time at the elementary school library back then, shelving books and reading to second graders so we could make the mortgage payments on time. There was nothing about that house. It had always been ours. Just the night before, Richard had been sitting across from me at the dining table, tapping his fingers against a lottery ticket he bought on a whim. He laughed and said, "Imagine if this thing hits." I smiled the way wives do when their husbands indulge in harmless fantasies. We ate pot roast. We watched the evening news. He kissed my cheek before bed. There was no warning in his voice. No sign that a jackpot would erase me from his vocabulary. When I finally turned the key in the ignition and drove home, the house looked exactly the same. The white shutters. The oak tree in the yard. The American flag Richard insisted on hanging every summer. Nothing about it screamed mansion. It was a comfortable 2-story colonial in a quiet Ohio suburb, about 2,400 square feet of shared history. I carried the groceries inside and set them on the counter. The kitchen clock ticked steadily. I noticed the faint scratch on the hardwood floor near the sink where we had once dropped a cast-iron skillet. I stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the silence. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Don't make this difficult. I stared at that one even longer. Difficult. As if I were the inconvenience. As if decades of shared bills, shared holidays, shared grief over lost parents and grown children moving away could be folded up like a sweater and placed in a suitcase. I didn't call him. I didn't type back. I walked upstairs instead, past the framed photographs lining the hallway, our wedding day in 1982, Richard in a tan suit and me in a lace dress my mother hemmed by hand. Our son at his high school graduation. Christmas mornings with matching pajamas. I paused outside the master bedroom and pushed the door open. The bed was made. His side table held the same digital clock and the same reading glasses he always misplaced. It struck me then that money had not changed the house. It had changed the language. It had changed him. But it hadn't changed the paperwork stored in the safe downstairs, the deed with 2 names printed clearly in black ink. I sat at the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself one slow breath. He might have won millions overnight, but he had forgotten one simple truth. I had built that life with him, brick by brick, payment by payment. And I wasn't going anywhere, not because he told me to leave, and not because he suddenly believed it was his alone. I didn't cry. I reached for my phone, not to answer him, but to scroll through the contact I hadn't needed in years. The attorney who handled our refinancing back in 2008. If Richard thought a text message could rewrite 42 years, he was about to learn that some foundations are stronger than numbers on a lottery ticket. I did not sleep that night. Richard did not come home, and I did not expect him to. Around 9 o'clock he sent a short message saying he was staying at a hotel downtown, something about meetings and financial advisors and needing space to think. Space. As if the air inside our own house suddenly belonged only to him. I lay on my side of the bed staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional car passing on Maple Ridge Drive. For years I had measured time by the rhythm of our shared routines, the coffee brewing at 6:30, the sound of the garage door at 5:15 in the afternoon. That night there was only silence, and in that silence his words replayed in my mind. Leave my mansion. I got up just before sunrise and walked through the house barefoot, feeling the cool hardwood floors under my feet. The living room looked exactly as it had the evening before, the throw blanket folded neatly over the arm of the couch, the family photos arranged carefully on the mantel. I picked up the framed picture from our 20th anniversary trip to Charleston, both of us smiling in front of pastel houses and cobblestone streets. Back then we had split a slice of pecan pie because we were trying to save money for a kitchen renovation. We talked about growing old together, about rocking chairs on the porch. There was no language of ownership in those conversations. There was no mine and yours. Only ours. By 7:30 I had brewed coffee and set a single mug on the table. I did not bother setting out his cup. I opened the small fireproof safe in the study and pulled out the folder labeled mortgage and deed. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. 2 names, printed clearly, side by side. Richard Allen Whitmore and Margaret Elaine Whitmore. I traced the letters of my own name with my finger, steady and deliberate. I thought about the years I worked at the library, about the summer I took on extra hours during inventory season so we could cover property taxes without dipping into savings. I remembered writing checks from my own paycheck when his company went through layoffs in the early 1990s. I had never once described the house as mine. I had described it as home. Around 10 o'clock my phone rang. It was Richard. His voice sounded different, faster, almost breathless with excitement. He talked about numbers, about advisors, about how life was about to change. Then his tone hardened. He said it would be easier if I packed a few personal things and stayed with our sister-in-law. For a while. He said he needed to protect his assets. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one simple question. Did you forget whose name is on the deed? There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to know he had not thought that far ahead. He brushed it off, said his lawyer would handle everything. I thanked him for letting me know and ended the call. My hands did not shake. Instead I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and searched for the attorney who had helped us refinance during the housing downturn years ago. His office was still open, still less than 15 miles away. I scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Richard believed that a winning ticket had rewritten our history overnight. As I closed the folder and placed it carefully back in the safe, I understood something he did not. Money might change the balance in a bank account, but it does not erase signatures in ink, and it does not erase the quiet strength of someone who has spent a lifetime building more than just walls and a roof. The attorney's office sat in a modest brick building just off Main Street, wedged between a dental clinic and a small insurance agency that still advertised paper policies in its window. I arrived 10 minutes early, parked carefully within the faded white lines, and turned off the engine. For a moment I remained in the driver's seat, watching people come and go with ordinary concerns written on their faces. No one there knew that my husband had tried to erase me with a single text message. No one there knew that overnight he had begun speaking a new language, one built entirely around possession. Inside, the receptionist greeted me by name. It had been years, but some professionals still valued continuity. I sat in the waiting area beneath a framed photograph of the courthouse downtown, listening to the soft ticking of a wall clock that sounded almost identical to the one in my kitchen. When Mr. Halpern stepped out to meet me, he looked older, his hair thinner and fully gray, but his handshake was steady. We sat across from each other at a polished wooden desk, and I placed the folder from our safe between us without drama. I did not begin with emotion. I began with facts. Married in 1982. House purchased in 1991. Refinanced in 2008. Both names on the deed. I explained the lottery winnings as calmly as if I were describing a change in weather. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making a note with a fountain pen that scratched softly against paper. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. He told me that in the state of Ohio, lottery winnings acquired during a marriage are typically considered marital property. He said that unless there had been a prenuptial agreement stating otherwise, the funds would not belong to one spouse alone. I watched his expression carefully, searching for hesitation. There was none. He then opened the deed and pointed to our names. Equal ownership. He explained that no one could legally force the other out without due process. The word due lingered in my mind. Due. As in what is owed. As in what cannot be dismissed because excitement and sudden wealth have clouded judgment. I asked him what would happen if Richard attempted to change locks or restrict access. His answer was simple. That would not be advisable. The law did not bend for impulse. I felt something settle inside me then, not relief exactly, but alignment. For the first time since the grocery store, the ground felt solid beneath my feet. Richard had spoken as if history could be edited with a jackpot announcement. But history, like property records, leaves a paper trail. Before I left, Mr. Halpern advised me to document everything. Messages. Calls. Financial changes. He suggested I open a separate account in my own name immediately, just as a precaution. I thanked him, gathered my folder, and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. The air felt warmer than it had that morning, or perhaps I simply noticed it more. As I drove home, I passed the same streets I had traveled for decades, the same diner where Richard and I used to split pancakes on Saturday mornings, the same park where we once walked hand in hand after church. None of it looked like a battlefield. It looked like a life. And that life had not been built by one person. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, white shutters catching the late-day sun. It did not look like a mansion. It looked like evidence. Richard came home just after 6 in the evening, his car pulling into the driveway with a confidence I had not heard in the engine before. I was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a coffee mug I had already washed once that day, more out of habit than necessity. The garage door lifted with its familiar mechanical groan, and for a brief second I wondered if he would walk in the same way he had for decades, loosening his tie, asking what was for dinner. Instead, the front door opened with unusual force, not violent but declarative, as if he were announcing a new chapter without consulting anyone else. He stepped into the kitchen still wearing the navy blazer he reserved for important meetings, his phone clutched in his hand like a trophy. There was a brightness in his eyes that did not feel like joy. It felt like ownership. He did not greet me. He looked around the room first, scanning the cabinets, the countertops, the stainless steel appliances we had chosen together after comparing prices for 3 months. Then his gaze settled on me. He spoke quickly, describing numbers I could barely process, millions before taxes, financial planners lining up to advise him, calls from people who had never remembered his birthday before. He said everything was moving fast. He said opportunities like this did not wait. I dried my hands with a dish towel and listened. I did not interrupt. When he paused for breath, I asked whether he had spoken to an attorney about how the winnings would be handled. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He said that he had already spoken to someone recommended by a colleague. He said that it was important to secure what was his before things became complicated. The word has landed in the air between us, heavy and deliberate. I reminded him gently that we were married, that the house and the accounts had always been shared. He waved his hand as if brushing away a minor inconvenience. He said the house would remain standing, but the future would look different. He mentioned renovations, luxury travel, perhaps relocating to Florida where the winters were milder and the taxes more favorable. In each sentence, I heard a subtraction. There was no we in his plans. There was no mention of the life we had built on this street where neighbors borrowed sugar and waved from porches. I asked him directly whether he intended for me to leave. He did not answer at first. He walked to the refrigerator, opened it, and stared inside as though it contained the blueprint to his new identity. Finally he said that it might be easier if I took some time away while he sorted things out. Easier for whom, I wondered. I told him I had already consulted an attorney that afternoon. That stopped him. His shoulders stiffened, and for the first time since he stepped through the door, the certainty in his posture flickered. I explained calmly that in Ohio, lottery winnings during a marriage are typically considered marital property. I explained that the deed bore both of our names. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply laid out facts the way one might lay out silverware before a meal. He stared at me as though seeing a stranger, perhaps because he had mistaken my silence for surrender. I watched realization creep into his expression, not fully formed but undeniable. The kitchen felt smaller then, not because the walls had moved, but because the illusion of unilateral control had begun to crack. He said he would speak to his lawyer again. I nodded and returned the mug to its place in the cabinet. Outside, the evening light settled over Maple Ridge Drive exactly as it had every other day. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. He believed the lottery had elevated him above the life we shared. I understood that it had simply revealed who he was willing to become when he thought no one could challenge him. The next morning the house felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because we were both measuring our steps. Richard left early, earlier than usual, dressed in a charcoal suit he had not worn in years. He did not eat the breakfast I placed on the table. He glanced at his phone repeatedly, as though the screen might confirm his new status with each notification. Before walking out the door he paused, just long enough to say that he would be meeting with his attorney again. He added that things would be clarified soon. I noticed he did not repeat the phrase "my mansion." That silence told me more than his excitement ever had. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began writing down every financial detail I could remember. Account numbers. Mortgage payments. Property tax statements. The year we replaced the roof. The year I used a small inheritance from my aunt to pay for the kitchen remodel instead of taking out another loan. For decades I had kept quiet records, not because I anticipated conflict, but because I believed in responsibility. Now those habits felt less like routine and more like preparation. Around noon my phone buzzed with a notification from our joint bank account. A large transfer had been initiated. I opened the application and saw that Richard had moved a significant portion of the balance into a newly created account under his sole name. The amount was not everything, but it was enough to signal intent. I did not panic. I took a screenshot and saved it. Then I drove to the bank branch on Elm Street where we had opened our first checking account more than 30 years ago. The lobby smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and fresh paper. I asked to speak with a manager and explained, calmly and clearly, that I was a joint account holder and needed documentation of all recent transactions. The manager recognized our last name immediately, likely from the local news already circulating about the winning ticket. He maintained professional composure, printed the statements, and confirmed that as a joint owner I had equal access and rights. I requested that no further large transfers be processed without dual authorization until the matter was reviewed. He nodded and assured me that safeguards could be noted on the account. When I stepped back into the parking lot, the sun was high and bright, casting sharp shadows against the pavement. I felt no urge to call Richard. I did not need to argue. Facts were accumulating on my side quietly, methodically. That evening when he returned, he appeared less animated than the day before. He mentioned tax implications and advisors cautioning patience. I listened as he spoke about protecting assets and structuring trusts. When he finished, I informed him that I had visited the bank and that all transactions were being documented. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalculation. He asked why I felt the need to do that. I answered simply that clarity benefits everyone. We stood in the kitchen facing one another, the same kitchen where we once debated paint colors and holiday menus. The difference now was not money. It was awareness. He had assumed excitement would overpower diligence. Instead, diligence was quietly rearranging the balance of control. He had won numbers on a ticket. I was building a case with paper and ink. And in a world governed by contracts and signatures, paper often speaks louder than celebration. 2 days later Richard informed me that his attorney had scheduled a formal consultation for both of us at a larger firm downtown, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a lobby that smells faintly of polished stone and ambition. He framed it as a courtesy, saying that transparency would avoid misunderstandings. I agreed without hesitation. By then I had already forwarded every bank statement and transaction alert to Mr. Halpern, who had prepared a concise summary of our marital assets and the relevant statutes. I dressed that morning the same way I had for church for years, a navy skirt, a cream blouse, modest heels that made a steady sound against the sidewalk. Richard wore a tailored gray suit and a new confidence that seemed slightly thinner than before. The elevator ride to the 20th floor was quiet except for the soft mechanical hum and the faint reflection of our faces in the mirrored walls. When we entered the conference room, 2 attorneys greeted us, both younger than we were, both efficient in their movements. Documents were already arranged neatly on the table. Richard began speaking before anyone else could, outlining his sudden fortune, his desire to protect his future, his intention to restructure assets in a way that reflected his new circumstances. He used phrases like strategic repositioning and long-term vision. I listened without interrupting. When one of the attorneys turned to me and asked for my perspective, I placed my own folder on the table and slid it forward. I stated simply that we had been married for more than 4 decades, that the house was jointly owned, and that the lottery winnings were acquired during the marriage. I mentioned that I had already consulted independent counsel. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. One attorney asked whether there was a prenuptial agreement. There was not. Another asked whether the ticket had been purchased with separate funds. It had not. Richard attempted to clarify that he had personally chosen the numbers, as though selection equated to sole entitlement. The attorneys exchanged a brief glance before explaining that under Ohio law, winnings obtained during a marriage are generally considered marital property subject to equitable division. The word equitable lingered in the air. Not equal necessarily, but fair. Fair did not align with the narrative Richard had been constructing in his mind. I watched as the certainty drained slightly from his posture. He asked whether there were mechanisms to expedite sole control. The response was measured. Such mechanisms would require mutual agreement or court proceedings. Mutual agreement implied my signature. Court proceedings implied scrutiny. I spoke only once more, stating that I had no intention of relinquishing rights that had been built through shared years, shared income, and shared responsibility. My tone remained even. There was no accusation in it, only clarity. The meeting concluded with recommendations for further review and a reminder that sudden wealth often benefits from patience rather than haste. In the elevator descending back to the lobby, Richard stood a few inches farther from me than usual. He did not speak until we reached the parking garage. He said that this was becoming unnecessarily complicated. I responded that complexity often appears when one person attempts to simplify a shared life into a single name. He had expected celebration to grant him authority. Instead, the law had introduced balance. As we drove home in silence, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, I understood that the true contest was no longer about money. It was about recognition. He was learning, piece by piece, that the foundation beneath our so-called mansion had been poured by 2 people, not one. When we returned home from the meeting downtown, Richard did not go into the kitchen or the living room. He walked straight into the study and closed the door behind him, something he had rarely done in all our years in that house. The click of the latch sounded deliberate, not angry, but strategic. I remained in the foyer for a moment, listening to the faint murmur of his voice as he made another call, likely to the same attorney who had promised him efficiency. The house felt steady around me. The oak floors. The staircase banister polished smooth from decades of hands. Nothing in Its structure suggested that ownership could shift because of a winning ticket. I went into the kitchen and prepared dinner the same way I always had, seasoning chicken, slicing green beans, setting the table with 2 plates. Routine was not denial. It was discipline. Around 7:30 he emerged from the study, his expression more controlled than triumphant. He sat across from me but did not immediately reach for his fork. Instead he studied me as though recalculating a variable he had underestimated. He said his attorney believed there might be room to negotiate an arrangement that would allow him primary control of the funds in exchange for a structured settlement. The word settlement carried a tone of transaction, as if 42 years could be itemized. I asked what that arrangement would require. He hesitated before admitting that it would likely involve me relinquishing certain claims in writing. I nodded slowly and took a sip of water. I reminded him that any document presented to me would be reviewed by my own counsel before I considered signing anything. He frowned slightly, not in anger, but in frustration at resistance. He said that this situation was becoming adversarial. I responded that clarity is not hostility. It is protection. After dinner he returned to the study while I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. In the hallway I paused in front of the family photographs again. Our son holding his college acceptance letter. Richard and I cutting a modest anniversary cake in the very dining room we had just left. I thought about the countless ordinary days that had built our marriage, days without headlines or jackpots. The next morning I received an email from Richard's attorney outlining a proposed agreement. The language was formal and dense, filled with clauses that attempted to define future distributions of wealth while minimizing my share of immediate control. I forwarded it directly to Mr. Halpern without commentary. Within hours he responded with annotations, highlighting sections that were legally imbalanced and recommending revisions that would reflect equitable distribution under state law. I printed both versions and placed them side by side on the dining table. When Richard came home that evening, I handed him the marked copy. I did not accuse. I did not raise my voice. I simply said that any agreement must reflect the reality of shared ownership and shared years. He read the notes silently, his jaw tightening as he reached the highlighted paragraphs. For the first time since the lottery announcement, I saw uncertainty that could not be disguised as confidence. He asked whether I intended to fight him in court. I answered that I intended to protect what was rightfully ours, not his, not mine, but ours. The difference mattered. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, as though searching for a strategy that did not involve acknowledging partnership. I folded the papers neatly and returned them to the folder. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing softly against the dusk. Inside, the illusion of unilateral control was fading. Richard had believed that wealth would grant him dominance. Instead, it had forced him into negotiation. And negotiation, unlike a text message, requires 2 signatures. The following week unfolded with a precision I had not anticipated. Richard stopped speaking in declarations and began speaking in proposals. He moved through the house more carefully now, as if aware that every word carried weight beyond emotion. On Tuesday evening he asked if we could sit down and talk without attorneys present. We met at the dining table where we had once planned vacations and balanced monthly budgets. The same chandelier cast the same soft light, but the atmosphere felt sharper, defined by boundaries that had finally become visible. He admitted that his initial reaction had been impulsive. He said the magnitude of the winnings had overwhelmed him. He spoke about fear, about advisors warning him that people might take advantage of him. I listened without judgment. Fear has a way of disguising itself as authority. When he finished, I told him that I had no intention of taking advantage of him. I only intended to ensure that 42 years of partnership were not erased by excitement. I suggested a structured plan that reflected both legal reality and mutual respect. Equal division of the lottery proceeds after taxes. Joint decision-making regarding the house. A formal agreement acknowledging our shared contributions. He leaned back and studied me as though recognizing a version of me he had overlooked for years. I reminded him gently that the kitchen renovation had been funded by my inheritance. That when his company downsized, my steady paycheck had carried us through 12 uncertain months. That the so-called mansion had been built not on a jackpot, but on decades of discipline. There was no accusation in my tone, only history. He asked whether I would consider selling the house and dividing the proceeds. I said that was an option if we both agreed it served our futures equally. The word equally remained central. Not generously. Not strategically. Equally. Over the next few days our attorneys exchanged revised drafts. The language shifted from unilateral control to equitable distribution. Clauses that once minimized my rights were replaced with provisions acknowledging shared ownership. Each revision felt less like a battle and more like a correction. On Friday afternoon Richard approached me in the study, the same room he had once closed off as if it were a command center. He placed the latest draft on the desk and said he was prepared to sign. I read through it carefully, line by line, not because I distrusted him, but because trust is strongest when verified. The agreement reflected what the law had already outlined. 50% of the net winnings allocated to each of us. The house to remain jointly owned unless mutually sold. No forced relocation. No erasure. When I finally looked up, he appeared smaller somehow, not physically, but in certainty. He asked whether this was what I wanted. I answered that what I wanted was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that a marriage cannot be reduced to a single name attached to sudden wealth. He nodded slowly. We signed the documents the following Monday in the presence of both attorneys. The signatures felt steady beneath my hand. As we walked out of the building, the autumn air was crisp and cool. The world had not shifted dramatically. There were no headlines, no dramatic gestures. But something fundamental had realigned. Richard had won a lottery. I had preserved a partnership. And in the quiet space between those two realities, the balance of our so-called mansion finally reflected the truth of who had built it. In the weeks that followed, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a mirror. Richard and I moved through the same rooms with a quieter awareness of each other. The agreement had been signed, the funds divided into separate accounts, and the structure of our shared assets clearly documented. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface. The oak tree still dropped leaves across the front lawn. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the left the way it had for years. But something internal had shifted in both of us. One evening, as I stood on the back porch watching the sun lower itself behind the neighboring rooftops, Richard joined me. He did not speak right away. He rested his hands on the wooden railing we had stained together one summer afternoon when our son was still in high school. Finally he said that he had not expected the lottery to test his character. He admitted that when the numbers were confirmed, he felt powerful in a way he had never felt before. He thought that power meant control. I listened without interruption. Power can be intoxicating, especially when it arrives suddenly and without warning. I told him that what frightened me was not the money, but the speed with which he tried to remove me from the narrative of our life. The text message still existed on my phone. 8 words that revealed more than any celebration ever could. He nodded slowly and said he regretted sending it. Regret does not erase memory, but it does acknowledge it. Over time we began discussing practical changes. We met with a financial planner together, this time seated side by side rather than across from each other. We established separate discretionary accounts while maintaining joint oversight on major decisions. The house remained in both our names. There was no relocation to Florida, no sudden demolition of the life we had built. Instead there was a recalibration. The mansion he had claimed in a moment of triumph returned to being what it always was, a home constructed through partnership. One Saturday morning I found myself alone in the kitchen again, sunlight spilling across the countertops. I brewed coffee and opened the safe, not out of fear, but out of habit. The deed lay inside, unchanged. 2 names printed clearly in black ink. I traced them once more, not as a reminder of conflict, but as confirmation of balance. Richard had won a lottery that changed our bank accounts. I had held steady long enough to protect something far less replaceable. Dignity does not arrive in a flash of numbers. It is built quietly, through patience and resolve. If someone had asked me months earlier what I would do if my husband suddenly became wealthy and told me to leave, I might not have known the answer. Now I do. I would stand still. I would gather facts. I would allow the law and the truth to speak louder than impulse. As I carried my coffee to the living room and sat beneath the framed photographs that still lined the mantel, I realized something simple. He had won millions in a single night. I had preserved 42 years in a single week. And between those two victories, only one ensured that the foundation of our so-called mansion would never again belong to one name alone.